All right, give it another minute here. It looks like we're 1 minute till noon, so give it a little bit of time for people to join here. But if you're already in, welcome. So we're going to try and keep this under an hour out of respect to everybody's time. For those of us that are using this as your lunch, want to be mindful of that. So we'll definitely try and keep it a tight ship today. Yeah, Robert, if lunch is an alien thing to you, we got to talk. I got a whole other presentation on the value of lunch. So, all right, we should be within a few seconds here of starting. There we go. All right, let's go ahead and get started promptly. So it's 11 a.m. and welcome everyone. I appreciate you taking time out to join us today. This is the first in a series of webinars that Public Technology Institute is going to be doing on kind of building skills for weathering out uncertain times. It's the theme for our conference this year, the Govit Conference in November. So if any of you are looking for a conference to attend, I highly recommend that. It's one of the few national conferences for technology leaders in the public space. So we can provide a follow-up email that'll have links for the conference, also links for joining PTI if you'd like to become a member. So today's webinar is a free webinar. However, we will be having a members only, we call it a tech talk, but it'll be a follow-up on this tomorrow at noon Western time, noon Pacific, where it's a deep dive conversation on topics that we cover and a chance to kind of have a more conversational session on this. So getting things started, the first session on this is on a subject called tactical communications. And I'm going to bring up the slide here and we'll get that started. All right. So the formal title for this is Tactical Communications, the Art and Science of Communicating for Impact. And the reason that I felt like this was a great starter for this whole series is how we communicate is kind of this bedrock for our performance. It's if you're in a leadership role, whether it's in IT or anything else, you understand the value of effective communication, especially when it's difficult, especially when you're in conflict or you're trying to get compliance or you're trying to convey a message to people that are listening to a lot of other messages and have a lot of other priorities, and you need to make sure that you're heard and understood. So today we're going to cover kind of an encapsulated version of this. And I'll go into the background and go into some of the soundbite kind of areas on it. But once again, if it's something that interests you, if you'd like to join us for the Tech Talk tomorrow, if you're a member, you'll be able to join us. If you're not a member, please feel free to look into joining, and we'd be happy to have you in the conversation. So the goals of the presentation today, which hopefully will be about 45 minutes. I'm trying to find a timer to keep myself honest on this, but if I riff, we'll all pay the price. But the goals of this are, number one, enhancing your professional image. One of our core missions at Public Technology Institute is to build confidence and capability in IT leaders. Leadership in the public sector is difficult enough. IT leadership in the public sector can be extraordinarily difficult, especially in times like this where you have a lot of outside forces that are making the job that much more difficult and more difficult for people to hear and understand our message on maintaining and continuing to utilize our technology services in service to our public. So some other objectives that we're going to try and build is the ability to foster effective relationships in senior leadership roles, even in kind of introductory leadership roles, supervision, middle management. Building relationships is really the cornerstone to getting things done. You've moved out of performing tasks and accomplishing objectives to overseeing other people accomplishing these objectives. And as you get further up that ladder, as you get into more executive roles or senior leadership roles, it's really about winning the hearts and minds of the people around you, your peers in executive leadership, and the senior executives that you serve on your boards and commissions or your councils, and getting them to understand and embrace and adopt your strategy for technology utilization for public service. Ideally, if we get that down, it lessens our personal stress. So part of that capable and confident demeanor is not carrying the anxiety of worrying about things that were said or ways they were said that are now creating stress that you have to carry with you because we have finite energy. So if you're expending energy worrying about the outcome from a conversation or an exchange or an argument that you had over something a day ago, a week ago, a month ago, there are people that still kind of worry themselves over conversations that could be a year old. Effective communication helps us to stem that at the start. Starting with a disciplined approach to communication makes it so that the outcome is predictable and ultimately allows you to take that off your plate. Part of that is mitigating conflict successfully. Conflict itself is not a bad thing. Conflict is the catalyst for change and evolution. But what we want to do is harness conflict in a way that is productive for the organization. And part of that is hearing and understanding different points of view, but in a disciplined communication method where it's not devolving into an argument or worse into silence on both sides, where now you have parties that don't want to talk to each other or don't want to listen to each other. And ultimately, if we get all of that right, it's helping you to build a team, your team within IT, your team within your leadership peers in the organization, but ultimately your team as the organization as a whole. Because ultimately, you are one team serving your public. To the public, they don't see all these individual facets. They don't necessarily understand how technology strategy overlaps with planning or development or with parks and recreation. It's our job to make it seem seamless and well orchestrated to our public. So mastering the art of communication on our part as an individual, taking individual accountability for that is the cornerstone for making that work for our public. So, speaking of the public, when we enter into these leadership positions in the public sector, we end up kind of competing in four arenas simultaneously. And these arenas are kind of the segments of the population that are actively paying attention to us. So first and foremost, we have our constituents. So these are the people that we serve. These are the residents of our community, the businesses, visitors, whoever the stakeholders are that are the direct recipients of the services you provide. They're probably the most important, so let's start with them. But then we quickly go into your peers. And by peers, I mean kind of everybody you work with. When we think of peers, we tend to think of people on our same level. So if you're a manager or department head, it's your fellow department heads that all have their mission they have to accomplish. But it's also the people who work for you and with you within the IT department or within your broader division. It's also your seniors, your city manager, deputy city manager, your elected officials. They're all part of that same team and all considered kind of peers. Now, breaking that out, there are some that are higher than others, and those are your bosses. So if you report to a deputy city manager, assistant city manager, or directly to the city manager, you probably indirectly at least report to your council or your board or whatever elected body you have. So you have to keep them in mind and you have to be able to adapt your communication style to meet their expectations because ultimately that is one of the most important groups for you to be able to serve your constituents and to serve your peers. And then finally, it's a consideration of the public at large. It's the idea that public service has become a bit of a spectator sport, especially when we don't uphold our mission. So nothing gets attention like a failure. And a lot of failures, if you deconstruct them, you can find that there was a communication flaw somewhere in there. For the IT realm, nothing speaks louder than a breach. But if you look at these breaches, if you start deconstructing them, there's almost always a human element there, and you can break that human element down to did we communicate effectively with everybody who has access to our systems the importance of a cybersecurity stance? Does everybody understand what our zero strategy means? Does everybody understand the importance of multi-factors? Does everybody understand the importance of vigilance in that space? So communication is the underlying bedrock for serving all four of these groups. So let's talk about TACCOM. And this is full disclosure. This is kind of shoehorning a much larger program that serves a much different audience. But it's taking elements of that I think apply to our jobs and apply to public service in general and condensing it into what is now a 45-minute webinar. But the original class on this was a 72-hour class. And this is the man who started it. His name is George Thompson, and he's a PhD in English literature. But he wasn't always an English professor. He started his career as a police officer. He was very into martial arts. And he was a cop back in the rocket and rollin' 70s and 80s. So for those of you old enough to remember the 70s and 80s, it was a bit turbulent back then, especially for law enforcement. What Dr. Thompson realized, when he wasn't a doctorate at the time, but as a police officer, some cops were better than others at de-escalating encounters, and meaning that they didn't have to resort to an escalation of force in using physical force or even lethal force to resolve conflicts in the field. And he saw the importance of that skill, and he realized they weren't teaching it. And truthfully, we don't teach it a lot. It's become more of a prevalent sentiment in the last decade or so, but really teaching the precision and the skills and the discipline of intentional communication, and not just being empathetic, but understanding how to effectively communicate. I don't think we put enough emphasis on that, especially for our senior leaders. So what he did is he developed this Verbal Judo Institute, and it's a for-profit enterprise that he started. This is not that. This is kind of a very light distilled version of some of the messaging from that, but this is not a verbal judo certificate program. However, these are the principles that I was able to peel out of that. So the overarching principle is that quality alone is not enough. So being good at something is only part of your success. There are other factors that contribute. So it's not good enough to be good. You've got to look good and you've got to sound good, or it's really not going to land good. So it's understanding all of the things that, especially as IT, we tend to sometimes deprioritize. A lot of people got into IT because they didn't want to be in a people-oriented discipline, because they liked the solitude and the ability to focus on completing a task on their own. But when you promote into leadership roles, and as the profession has evolved, we're kind of leaving that in the dust. This is becoming a more people-focused discipline. And because of that, other things matter. Appearance matters. And I'm not talking about dressing fashionably. I'm not talking about dressing in an expensive manner, but I am saying that how you present yourself is part of your message, and we'll see just how important a part it is as we get further in the presentation. So communication in its entirety is the key. You have to use everything at your disposal to make sure that whatever message you're trying to get across, whether it's one-on-one or one-to-many or one to an elevated group, if you're presenting to your board or to your council, if you're dealing with a subordinate that you need to discipline, if you're dealing with a constituent that you need to educate, your ability to use everything at your disposal to get that message across is critically important. Not paying attention to these other facets take away some of your effectiveness, and you're leaving tools on the table that you could be using. So think of it as a holistic excellence that's required. It's really developing a refined and intentional communication skill that'll serve you in all of those realms. So when we talk about verbal judo, the philosophy here is an important underlying part of the entire presentation, because we're talking about an Eastern philosophy that's being applied to Western rhetoric. Part of the charm of Western civilization is that we are a very verbal society. The First Amendment is freedom of speech. We value that more than anything. And now, especially, we're living in a world where so many people have so many channels that there's just a ton of background noise. And there's a really good book called Noise that's about kind of sorting out core messaging and what you need to know versus what you're hearing across all of these different dimensions. So when we talk about applying judo principles to Western rhetoric, what we're talking about is the discipline, but also the responsiveness and utilizing the efforts of the person you're communicating with to achieve the goals you're trying to achieve. So if you break down judo, ju means gentle, do means way. So it's gentle way. So if we compare it to, say, karate, karate's an attack art. Karate is you're trying to get the first punch in, trying to land the first blow. When we think of fighting, we kind of think of that in general, boxing, mixed martial arts, whatever. It's all about kind of this, forward attack. Judo is 100% responsive, and it's using the energy of your opponent to achieve your goals. So you're redirecting and deflecting energy as opposed to countering it, as opposed to meeting it head on, because so much is wasted in head on confrontation. So we're emphasizing efficiency and effectiveness over winning. So, and we'll talk about ego and we'll talk about the importance of that mentality of you represent the organization and you're trying to achieve a goal, you're not trying to win a contest. So at the end of it, you have to achieve this mastery through adaptation. And when I say it's a discipline, it's a discipline. A lot of what I'm going to present today runs contrary to instincts that we've had for a long time. Evolutionary instincts, but also instincts that we've kind of had reinforced around us because of how Western society has kind of moved with communication overall. So using that comparison, verbal karate versus verbal judo. Let's think of verbal karate as the unprofessional use of language, meaning your language is not tied to an objective for the organization, that it's much more about you personally. It's about micro wins. It's the little jab, it's the little joke, it's the pointed comment. It's something to win each exchange without understanding the impact of that win or of the combination of the exchanges. So you're expressing personal feelings. It's very self-referential and indifferent to the audience. We've all heard people talk that refer to themselves and what they've achieved and what they're doing, but have no reference to how they are benefiting their efforts, their actions, their communication is benefiting the people that they're talking to or the people they're serving. So if communication becomes intensely self-referential, it's a sign of other unhealthy things. And we'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. But what it ultimately means is you're losing contact with your audience. So you're going to generate off-target reactions. So this is what I talked about with the stress issue, that when you have an exchange with someone and you walk away from it going, I think I just made things worse, you have to carry that stress with you. Now, if you're indifferent, then perhaps public sector isn't the right place for you. There are lots of companies out there sending people to the moon and doing all sorts of cool things that don't seem to care about having a personal connection to the public. But if you've chosen a profession of public service, my guess is in one of your interviews, you said, I like to help people. And I like to think that we live up to that. And when we volunteer to take on leadership roles, we take that to heart and we keep that in mind in everything we do, including our communication style. So when we talk about verbal judo, it is a very intentional use of language. It's the professional use. And by professional use, I don't mean multisyllable words or saying things that people probably don't understand. I'm talking about using language to accomplish objectives that belong to the organization, that you almost make yourself invisible as an individual because you represent the organization so fully that it kind of takes some of the wind out of people's sails when they try to fight you on it, because they understand you're not falling back on your individual authority, your individual power. You're falling back on the power of the organization, of the mission that you've all adopted. So you're expressing organizational values, but at the same time displaying empathy and understanding to your audience. Understanding that is the path to cooperation. Compliance is where they are going to go with what you say, even if it goes against their beliefs. Cooperation is where you have got them to understand and believe what you're doing, and now they're doing it because they support the mission too. That is where alignment comes in. So you want to stay in focused contact with your audience, and you're always focused on outcome-based communication. You're always thinking ahead. It's the difference between chess and checkers. Checkers, you're just taking pieces. You're just kind of jumping and taking, jumping and taking. With chess, it doesn't matter how many pieces you lose. Your objective is checkmate. And checkmate is not taking out the king. It's putting the opponent in a position where they have no other moves. So that's a great analogy of what we're trying to achieve here. We're not trying to harm them. We're not trying to hurt them. We're not trying to exert power on them. We're not trying to force them to do anything. We're trying to put them in a position where they understand the need to follow what we're saying. And that applies whether you're dealing with the public, all four arenas, your constituents, your peers, your superiors, and the public at large. So the starting place for this, staying with our Eastern philosophy, is a Mushin state of mind. So Mushin translates literally as no mind. And this seems easy. This seems kind of intuitive. It is not. Because what we're saying is you have to basically approach every conversation, every engagement as disinterested as you can. And that sounds counterintuitive because I just told you you're trying to accomplish the objectives of the organization, you're trying to accomplish the mission. But what I'm talking about here is personal interest, because you want to remain open and flexible and unbiased because you want to leave opportunities open to achieve the same objective, even if it's through a different path. And the problem is when your ego gets involved, that's when you can't let go. And so I started my career in a very different path. I worked in 911 as a 911 dispatcher for a police department for 20 years at the start of my career. Started very young. And I saw the same thing that Dr. Thompson saw. I saw officers that we jokingly knew every time they pulled somebody over, that person was going to probably go to jail or to the hospital from the encounter. I'm not proud to say that. At the time, it was kind of, the rough and tumble humor of the time. But looking at it now and looking at the outcome of that, how that blossomed into so many social justice issues over the years, it was this indifference to how they were being perceived by the people they're serving. It was, I am in charge. And a lot of it had to do, when you look back, not every officer was like that. The vast majority were getting their job done in a very efficient, very quiet manner. And it's because they understood and valued the mission. It wasn't about their ego. And I've seen this outside of law enforcement. I've seen it in IT because we all know that some IT people can get a little dogmatic, that you get people that have come up through the ranks or have spent so much time dedicated to a single discipline that they are passionate about it. And that's not a bad thing, but it also means that their ego can be closely tied to it. So it's very hard for them to come into a situation disinterested or open, flexible, and unbiased. So as the communication professional, you're going to have to bring that to the party. So if you've gone through any kind of sensitivity training or gone through any emotional intelligence training or assessments, you've probably talked about situations that create unconscious bias. So I want to cover that here because it does come into play. Because if we're going to approach every situation in a disinterested, open, flexible way, we have to be aware of the biases we may be bringing. One of the most prevalent in the public sector is repetition. It's when we're dealing with the same person over the same issues over and over again. When I was in 911, we had frequent callers. We had people that would call every day, sometimes every hour. If you work a desk or if you work a department where you have the public coming up, sometimes you get the same people coming up. At your council meetings, you have people that come up and draw a comment card and speak every single meeting. What that repetition does is creates an expectation that they're going to do the same thing every time, that you start to close off your openness to communication with them because you're assuming that there's simply no way to get past that. So that becomes this bias to communication. Also, when people use challenging statements, the whole, do you know who I am? If you're dealing with your peers in the department head realm, you probably know, and I haven't worked in an organization or seen an organization yet where all department heads were created equal. Depending on the culture, depending on the focus, depending on budgeting, depending on a lot of things, some department heads have more impact than others. And with that can come implied authority. So even though you both are department heads, you may feel in some cases you're in a superior position, in some places an inferior position. But when people use these challenging statements to try and reinforce that, it can trigger a defensive mechanism, very limbic. And we're going to talk about that involuntary thing, but that can immediately put you in a situation of bias. There's also physical traits. I mean, it's just an acknowledgement that age, race, gender, even if we're not using them to actively discriminate, sizing somebody up and taking those things into account can put us in a predisposition that is not accurate. Can put us in a predisposition where we assume they're going to behave a certain way, they're going to react to us in a certain way, we have to approach them in a certain way. If someone's above a certain age, do I have to talk more slowly and more loudly? If someone's young, do I have to kind of snap my fingers to get their attention? It's these biases that make effective communication more difficult than it needs to be. Because if we start with an open assessment and finding out what they're actually about, we can then quickly adapt to that and really get to the point really quickly. You also have language barriers. And in IT, we have more than most because if you work in IT, you speak another language. If you go into a staff meeting and talk about a network refresh and start going into all the protocols that go into network maintenance, you're going to lose people pretty quick. And truth be told, we lose each other. If your infrastructure team is talking to your GIS team, they are speaking different languages. So it's not just technical languages, but it's also people that have maybe English as a second language, or they've just sort of had difficulty expressing themselves all their lives. So these barriers to effective communication on the part of the person you're talking to are things that you can help overcome using kind of a tactical empathy and giving them the space to communicate in the way that they feel most comfortable and is most effective for them. Another thing is attire and appearance. So how people dress overall, we kind of put a judgment on that. Whether we consciously realize that or not, how people dress affects how their message comes across, and how you dress affects how your message comes across. We're going to kind of focus on that, but I want you to be aware of it in terms of bias. And then observed behavior. So how people act when they're communicating, whether they're nervous. If you've seen people, if you've sat on a panel in an interview, you see all these people that get nervous, that wring their hands, that stare at the ceiling, that don't make eye contact, or people that make too much eye contact. They're a little too intense. All of these things set up biases that may or may not be true for us. The other factor that we need to just acknowledge is organizational stressors. Our organizations have cultures, and those cultures either foster effective communication or hinder effective communication. So first and foremost, politics. We all have office politics. Some organizations deal with their politics especially well. They're rare, but they're precious, and they are a lighthouse for the rest of us. Most are somewhere in between. You have some that have high dysfunction. You have some that the politics are brutal and very Game of Thrones-esque, if you've seen that one. But most organizations kind of exist in a spectrum between those two poles. But understanding the specifics of your politics, your cultural norms, taboo things, what your sacred cows are, all of these things help you to develop a communication path and a communication strategy that's more effective, that kind of deals with those. But it takes energy. Relationships. So the relationship between your coworkers, between the community that you serve, your constituents, all those relationships also come into play, because your organization as whole may have very different relationships with your constituents compared to neighboring cities or counties. And then your norms for communication. Are you hierarchical? Are you more flat? I've worked in organizations where it was considered taboo to talk to the city manager directly or to electeds directly. I've worked in other ones where it was encouraged, where they were, hey, go out and have lunch, go out and have breakfast with your council. So this goes back to kind of how we all got our foundational training in communication. And it was on a playground in kindergarten for most of us. And on a kindergarten playground was where we kind of got our first immersion into having to communicate and deal with a peer group that we didn't choose. So, and there were really three rules that came out on the playground. One was you either yielded immediately. So if somebody tried to take your lunch money, you gave them your lunch money and you just said, have a nice day, and we're going to go on with our lives. Or you could fight. You could raise your fists and just try to go toe to toe with them right out of the gate. Or your third option was give them the lunch money, but then go talk to the recess monitor, go talk to the teacher, so report them. I don't believe that we've invested in moving beyond these rules in a lot of our forums. I can't think of a class that I took in K through 12 or even in college that prepared me to move past that. As a matter of fact, I can think of a lot of conflicts where I had to resort to one of those three options. And developing a mature, intentional communication strategy allows you to move past this playground mentality when it comes to communication. So when we talk about conflict personas that result from that, you end up with kind of three personas. So the two easiest are on the left and right here. So the one that you're seeing on the left is the easy one. This is the yield. They have one key because all you do is ask them once and they will give. These are people that will not fight you. They are genuinely just don't want conflict, whether it's because they're nice or they just don't want conflict. They will give in right away. On the other side, you have the people that are going to report you to the lunch monitor. These are the ones that are affectionately called wimps. So what it means is they're not going to engage with you at the time. They don't feel that they have either the skill or the desire to engage in conflict in the moment. So what they're going to do is go along with it, but then they're going to talk about you behind your back. And that could be with your superior. It could be reporting you to HR. It could be reporting you to, a superior in their line of chain of command or in your chain of command. But really what they're doing is saying, I don't feel that I'm able to engage with you right now, but I do feel threatened and I'm going to take this to somebody else. And it typically does not end in the desired outcome that you'd like. Most people are difficult. So difficult people require multiple keys. So a difficult person is the one that wants to engage. And this is really what this course is all about, what this presentation is all about. It's dealing with them. It's understanding that they're not going to go with what you want right away, but if you continue to talk with them and you have an effective communication strategy, you can unlock cooperation from them once you've met their needs to move forward. So let's take this down a peg. Let's talk about basic psychology for people. So your identity is composed of three elements. This is kind of a Freudian take. And if we want to talk about Jung or something else, that's another talk. But popular psychology right now says that we have three elements to our persona. We have our id, which is our unconscious self. It's the part of us that's tied deeply to the limbic brain. So if you look at the physical anatomy of your brain, your higher functions, your reasoning, your logic, your language, it's all right here beneath your forehead in the prefrontal cortex. And those are the most recent additions to your physiology. So that is where we conduct kind of our very conscious and very deliberate acts. As you go towards the back and deep, you get to the limbic brain, which is the reactionary brain, where a lot of involuntary stuff happens. And your id is kind of wrapped around that. So your id is the part of you that can come out under duress or stress that you have very little control over. It's the part of you that unconsciously kind of dominates how you present yourself in the world. Your ego is your self-esteem by self. And the best analogy I can give on this is think of it like how you see yourself in a movie. As you go through the day, as you're getting ready in the morning, as you're getting dressed, as you're driving to work, as you're meeting with people, you have this kind of ongoing narrative in your head that you have this understanding of how you look and how you sound and how you're presenting. And it's your perception on that. Your superego is when you're removed from that, usually involuntarily, and forced to see yourself from an outside perspective that doesn't reconcile with your ego. So an analogy that I've used for this is imagine that you've got a big interview and you're getting ready in the morning and you're in the mirror and you've got your jacket, you got your lapel pin, you've got your tie, your dress shirt, you've got your whatever you're going to wear, your hair's done. And you're like, thumbs up, I am ready for the day. You go out confident. As you get to the location for the interview, they have floor to ceiling glass and you catch yourself in a reflection and you don't look the way you imagined. Your outfit's not fitting you the same. You look a little more frumpy. Maybe your shirt's untucked in the back. Maybe you have something going on that doesn't match the way you envisioned yourself. You're suddenly put into a superego position. That now you're seeing yourself from outside in a way that doesn't reconcile with how you see yourself. And it can quickly bring you to a place where your id comes out, your insecurities rise. All of a sudden, it's like, I've got this interview. I don't have time to deal with this. I don't have time to fix this. So now that's consuming your thoughts. So it makes it much more hard to use that prefrontal cortex to deal with things in a rational and a logical method, and you become defensive. This is where, we've all done this on both sides of the table. I have sat on one side of the table, sweating profusely, fidgeting with my hands, playing with my paper, trying to maintain eye contact. I've sat on the other side and watched hundreds of people do that as an interviewer. So it's just a part of our basic anatomy. And it doesn't just come out in interviews. It comes out anytime we're in a difficult conversation or what we believe is a high yield, high risk conversation. So with that in mind, these numbers were in the book, the Verbal Judo, that was written by Dr. Thompson. And these were from 40 years ago. I would imagine these numbers are different now and not favoring content. That when we look at this, what it's basically saying is the actual words, the actual literal message we're trying to get across is about 10% of the message that's being sent. 30% is your voice, your inflection, your tone, how you present it. 60% of that, the remaining, is other nonverbal cues. So this is how we dress. This is how we act. This is how we present ourselves. It's all these conscious and unconscious decisions that go with the package when we're talking to somebody. It's also the mode. This is the whole argument about virtual meetings versus in-person meetings. When you're in an in-person meeting, you get all the benefits of all of those nonverbal skills. When you're in a virtual meeting, you lose some. And when you're on a call, you lose even more. And when you're in an email, you lose even more. How many times have you had to take a phone call over an email because of its tone? And you think, wow, they're just words. How could there be tone? I simply said things the way they are. But anybody that's received an as per my last email knows what tone is all about. So when we talk about all of these nonverbal attributes that can help us get the message across in a more accurate method, that's what I'm talking about. That when you strip those things away, you lose that ability to influence and to clearly communicate the message. So there's a quote by Amy Cuddy. If you're not familiar with her, she's a pretty renowned speaker now. She's a Harvard professor. She wrote a book called Presence, and she really emphasizes how you physically present yourself affects not only how people perceive you, but how you perceive yourself. So the quote here about our bodies change our minds, and our minds can change our behavior, and our behavior can change our outcomes. It really resonates with the message I'm talking about outcome-driven communication. So on the nonverbal cues, physical appearance, I'm not giving fashion advice. I'm not telling you you have to wear a suit every day or you have to wear just dress clothes every day. But I am telling you there's a reason why firefighters and doctors and even staff at high-end restaurants wear uniforms. And it's because it sets an immediate unconscious expectation of their authority, their role, their presence that starts things off at a layer above a cold start. So when we talked about, uniforms for police officers, the LAPD under Chief Parker in the 1940s and 50s, they started the trend on the West Coast of the dark blue, crisp uniform, hat, long sleeve wool. And it was because he realized that the uniform was the first part of the use of force. And Parker learned that fighting in World War II, when depending on the uniform you wore, you projected a different stance. Officers dressed different than non-coms, non-coms dressed different than your enlisted personnel. So it's taking all of that learning and applying it to communication. Once again, your mannerisms and your stance, being mindful of unconscious things you do or conscious things. If you cross your arms, that's a message of defensiveness. That's a message of I am starting to close off. If you speak with your hands, it's a sign of engagement, it's a sign of passion. I'm not saying one is better than the other. Understand where you're using it, what you're getting across in that moment. And then ultimately, voice and tone. Some of us really struggle with that. Some of us, when we're under stress, we get a little high-pitched. Some of us talk really fast when we get into that. And once again, IT, not a lot of people that were really into the communication thing. A lot of people got into IT because they just didn't want to have to do that. And now all of a sudden, as part of the job, they're having to adopt those skills. So this is really kind of an overview of needs, but like I say, there are other trainings out there where we can go deeper dive on this. So what that ends up meaning is that we have to listen past words. So especially when we are working with somebody or communicating with somebody that's in an emotional state, what they express as anger or rage or argument is probably more an expression of actual anxiety and fear and loss of control. So for us, responding instead of reacting is critical, because if we respond to anger with anger, if we're just doing an arms race escalation on this, and once again, playing checkers, not chess, that whoever takes the piece wins, you end up with both of you probably in HR or in an unemployment line at some point, because you've completely, at that point, once it becomes ego on ego, the message of the organization, the purpose in the discussion starts losing volume in the conversation. Now it's just ego on ego. I need to win this. And so if you're able to thoughtfully retreat into a position of well-studied response, it allows you to deal with that anger and rage and argument as it really is, with the anxiety, fear, and loss of control. So part of that is understanding your triggers. If any of you are a certain age, the photo here is from a movie called Forbidden Planet. It was in the 1950s. The gentleman on the left is Walter Pidgeon, and the gentleman on the right is a very young Leslie Nielsen in his first acting role. But the premise of the movie is that we colonize this planet, find an ancient civilization, try to harness their technology. And what they were able to do, the ancient civilization found a way to manifest things based on thoughts, but they quickly wiped themselves out because their id, their inner beings, took control of it, and they couldn't control the monsters they created. So that's kind of the premise of this. And I think that's so relevant to what we're talking about here, because how many times have you either seen or been involved in conversations where the id, somebody's id, took over and the whole conversation went sideways because they are defending their unconscious ego? They are now in a position where they are literally either in a fetal position or a fight position because they feel so threatened by what's being said and how it's being said. So it's retreating back and saying, number one, my role is to represent the organization. Number two, silence is an ally. There is nothing more powerful in a heated argument than stopping and conceding and saying, you know what, can I take a minute? Can I take just a minute to reflect on what you've said? And follow that up with a regroup on, okay, if I understand what you just said, this is what you're trying to get across. Can I ask you a couple of questions to clarify my understanding? Think about how that takes the wind out of their sails. You didn't win, but you diffused it. You did something better than win. You're regrouping now on an element of common understanding. So by responding and not reacting, you're able to refer back to established points of agreement. You're able to kind of back that up. And it shows so much respect and deference to say, you know what, this is elevated. I'm giving you the stage. And to let me know, help me understand where you're coming from, that you're elevated to this point, that we are elevated to this point, because you're focusing on the message. Keep going back to what you want to achieve and not what you want to do in that moment. Questions are undoubtedly one of the most effective tools in your arsenal to get somebody to not just articulate what they are trying to get across, but to start to become curious about what you're trying to get across, because now they're providing bridges for commonality. So that gives you an opportunity to restate their understanding and restate it in a way that you start overlapping what you're trying to get across, finding those Venn diagram overlaps, and also seeking new points of agreement to further the conversation. So what this ends up boiling down to is a 5-step process. And once again, this was a 3-day course condensed down to 45 minutes. There's a lot more to unpack here, but the takeaway is this LEAPS acronym. So when you're engaged in a difficult conversation or something you know that's going to be a difficult conversation, even if it's just for you, start by listening. Project that you are an active listener. Show them that you're listening. Repeat back things they're telling you. Give them opportunities to speak. Don't talk over them. Empathize. When you're repeating back, show an understanding, not just of what they're trying to say, but what you see them feeling. That, oh, that's important to you. Wow, I can see how passionate you are about that. Ask questions. Secret weapon. Take the conversation to questions. Can you tell me more about that? Can you tell me how that started? Can you tell me how that's impacted you or your team? Paraphrase. Well, based on what we just talked about, this is what I'm hearing from you. So can I describe to you the message that I'm receiving on this? And then at the tail end, you summarize. A great conversation ends with something like, hey, I really respect and I appreciate the passion that you've put into this. I appreciate your willingness to have a deep discussion on this. I know it was difficult, but let's chart out the things that we've agreed on now that we can move forward with. And let's start tabling the things that we don't see eye to eye on right now so we can find a resolution in the near future. That is an ideal exit from anything. If you're talking about whether you're talking to your electeds, whether you're talking to your city manager, you're talking to your peers, you're talking to your staff, but you notice that it's not different, that I'm not adjusting my ego based on who I'm talking to on that. It's all based on an outcome. That same phrase works with all levels of the organization. So when we talk about verbal judo, the concepts are modular and you apply what you need to based on your skills, based on the things, because I'm not saying everybody here is starting from a blank slate. Most of you have had to learn a lot of these skills. I'm sure a lot of you are nodding and kind of like, oh, I already know that. Some of you may know all of this already, and that's outstanding. I appreciate you being here. But for those of you that still have gaps in that, just remember your goal is to gain voluntary compliance. And the goal of tactical communications is to provide you the tools necessary to get to that as often as possible. And this applies beyond work. This applies to personal relationships, to your marriage, your children, any place else that you deal with people where you sometimes need to get a message across that you have a solid point you need to make. So once again, thank you all for being here. It looks like I was over by just about 2 minutes, but I think that's going to work for our purposes. For those of you that are PTI members, we are going to have a members-only tech talk on this tomorrow at noon. There'll be a Zoom link that'll be provided to you if you'd like to attend that. That'll give us a chance to kind of do a deep dive on the stuff I couldn't cover in 45 minutes. But if you are not a member, this is an opportunity for you to take a look at our website, pti.org, and see if a membership's the right thing for you, because this is just the starting point in a series. And we're going to be covering a lot of other facets of leadership in public technology that are designed to get you through kind of these challenging times and the challenging times we know that are ahead. So thank you all once again. This was an honor and a pleasure to be able to conduct this. And what I'm going to do is open this up to some brief questions. We've got another 15 minutes here. So I'm going to try and take as many softball questions as I can here. So let me open up the chat and see. So one of the first comments here was Robert Newell, what is this lunch you speak of? That's a whole other conversation. That may be a presentation on the value of lunch. I'm going to tell you all right now, free advice. If you are eating lunch at your desk, you are wasting a resource. You should be out there meeting and greeting, especially if you are a manager or a department head or a CIO. We'll be getting a copy of this presentation afterwards. If you are a PTI member, you will have access to a copy of the slide deck and the ability to view the recording on it. I believe Darryl will go over what we're, okay, that's finance department would agree to that. So it must have been a point when we were going through there. Even regional dialects can be interpreted. That's true, that there's a lot to the language barrier thing that is not just cultural or ethnic. There are language barriers between departments. There are departments that speak a whole different dialect than a neighboring department. So with that, anybody by show of hands that wants to ask a question? Let me see Q&A. We already answered that. We'll be getting a copy of the presentation. Okay. Not seeing. I don't know if we can raise hands on this. This is a webinar, so I really don't know how that works. One of our staff is talking about the cultural aspect. I think that culture is a combination. It's much less about your aspirations and much more about what you tolerate. So your culture is defined by what you allow. So if you have a culture that allows for, and in some cases embraces, full contact sport communication, that's going to dictate things. And that's where one person electing not to participate in that form of kindergarten play can shape the entire culture for the organization. All right. Well, if that's the case, looks like we've got our questions answered. Once again, those of you that are PTI members that would like to come into the Tech Talk tomorrow to do a deeper dive on this. For those of you that are not members, I ask you to explore it. Just take a look and see if it's right for you, because we will be going over a lot of other subjects that are similar to this. I appreciate you all being here. I appreciate your time, and thank you so much.